Bibles for lesson number 11 and turn with me to Judges chapter 2. We left off last time in Judges chapter 2, and we need to look at a couple of the things in connection with the first course of punishment. And especially do I want us to spend a little bit of time here at the opening section of this lesson dealing with the right that God has, that He reserved to Himself, to be merciful and compassionate in His dealings with Israel, even though that law contract had no provisions in it for Him to do that, and called for Him to deal with the nation Israel solely on the basis of their merit. While you're turning to Judges chapter 2, let me take the sign down once again so we can utilize our board. You'll notice that I have left the diagram from the last time on the board here. And it might just be worthwhile for a moment, in case there's been a span of time between you watching the last tape and this one here, just to make some sense out of the squiggles that are back there. I know my handwriting, if you can even call it that, isn't the greatest in the world, and I try and write a little slower than I normally do at times, especially when I know that you're going to be looking at the board. And even then, sometimes I'm just not conscious of that, and the squiggles end up being hen scratch and indecipherable lines on the board there. But let me just take a moment here. Once again, the little triangle here representing Mount Sinai, and the law coming in once again. The squiggle there representing the crossing of the Jordan River. The J-O down here representing the time under the book of Joshua, where things went well for Israel overall, and God gave them the good that He had talked about giving them for their cleaving to Him. And Joshua acknowledged that, as we saw at the end of the book of Joshua there, but he also acknowledged the fact that the seeds of rebelliousness were evident there in the nation. And he knew that if those things were not done away with, and they didn't put away their gods and incline their false gods and incline their heart unto the Lord, that the generation following Him, instead of receiving the good, would receive what God has sworn He would do for lack of proper performance, bring the courses of punishment upon them. And Joshua knew that the generation following him would be confronted with the first course of punishment if they did not perform and continue to cleave unto the Lord. So he exhorted them to incline their hearts unto Him. And then he made that covenant with them, with that stone of witness once again, for the fact that they have sworn faithfulness to the issue of sticking with the Lord. But that whole thing was just wasn't worth what they said once again. And we saw all that at the beginning of Judges. The first two chapters here once again describe the fact that the generation following Joshua, it knew not the Lord, it said, and it departed from Him and forsook Him, and began worshiping the gods of the nations round about them. And they did not put away those nations, and they failed to comply with the commandments set forth in that law contract, and started utterly destroying those nations that were the hotbed of Satan's plan of evil on this earth, and the spewing out of the abomination of the course of this world He had charted for it. And they failed to do that, and they got wrapped up in it instead, and they ended up following the course for this world. God's own nation ended up becoming, in conduct-wise, just like the other nations out there. And of course, that was to the joy of the satanic policy of evil against Israel. And we'll see here in this lesson, at the end of the time when the first course of punishment was being brought upon the nation, in the things you see in the first opening chapters of 1 Samuel there. Things had gotten so bad in Israel that the tabernacle itself was in the hand of Satan's own men. And the leaders of the nation come to Samuel and request that he do something that makes them like the rest of the nations. And we'll talk about that in more detail when we get over there, and the significance of that, and the acme almost of rebelliousness that was, and the straw that broke the camel's back in connection with that made them worthy of coming under that second course of punishment. But the first course of punishment gets itself underway here in the book of Judges, and everything you see in the book of Judges is Israel under that first course of punishment. The things that are spoken about in the book of Ruth take place in the day of the Judges, and therefore you're under the first course of punishment. And the things going on in the first 15 chapters of 1 Samuel, you're still under that first course of punishment. And that's why the diagram on the board here, once again, the one in the circle representing the time of the first course of punishment, and there's your book chapter and verse parameters once again for the first course of punishment. Judges 1:1 through to 1 Samuel 15:35, or the end of the 15th chapter there in 1 Samuel. And a little squiggle on the bottom here. I know you can't understand what that says by looking at it unless you get right up to the TV screen there and take a quick look at it. I'm having trouble about 1 foot away here, but I overdrew some things. But that's like a down staircase there. And each one of the little J's there is representing what we ended up dealing with last time here in Judges 2, beginning in verse 16, where the book of Judges gets its name from. Talked about the fact that God raised up judges for them during this time. And while the judge was doing his job, Israel responded, and there was a stay in the advancement of the first course of punishment. But when the judge died, as verse 19 says here, it came to pass when the judge was dead that they returned and corrupted themselves more than their fathers in following other gods to serve them and to bow down to them. They ceased not from their own doings, nor from their stubborn way. That verse is telling you what to expect as you go on through the book of Judges there until you come to the identifying mark of the beginning of the second course of punishment. You're being told how to look at things, how to understand what took place, and that's what that illustrates there. God raised up a judge, and things are all right for as long as the judge is there. The judge dies, and then they plummet themselves down worse than their fathers. Another judge is raised up, and things are okay for a while, then the judge dies, and they drop down further, and they're getting worse and worse. They cease not from their stubborn ways, and eventually they put themselves in a position of being worthy for that second course of punishment. Well, those are the things we covered last time, and I told you I wasn't going to be doing review in these tapes because you got the previous tapes to go back and review if you need to. But in view of the fact that the diagram was still there, and to get our minds going again here, I think it's important just to take those few minutes and say those things again and bring ourselves up to speed here. But now we want to look here in Judges 2 once again at this issue concerning God raising up the judges. I told you last time, and you recognize it, that this is not something that's contracted for in the law contract. You can't go back there in the law contract and see the issue in the law, a rider clause, for example, that comes along and says that God will raise up judges for them under the first course of punishment. It's not there. You go back to Leviticus 26, you look at the details of the first course of punishment, there's nothing there about God being merciful in this manner and holding off aspects and intensities of that first course by raising up a judge and giving them a stay in those things. That's not part of what's contracted for. But you need to understand that what God's doing here is something that He had reserved the right to do. And it's a good thing He did. Otherwise, He would have had to wipe out the nation Israel. The truth of the matter is, their performance, their conduct would demand that take place. And God told Moses, back before they've even left the Mount Sinai area, that He was going to operate on the principle of mercy and compassion with His people outside of what that law contract contracted for their own good. Otherwise, He would have to wipe them out. And the reason why I want you to see that here right now is not only so that you appreciate it here under the first course of punishment, but we're going to be confronted with it again right after we get out of the first course of punishment. And we're going to be confronted with it actually a number of times throughout the various courses as they proceed on. In truth, throughout each one of the courses of punishment, God mercifully deals with His nation and does some things that are outside of what the contract called for. It's not that He's violating the contract. Don't get me wrong. That's not what I'm implying at all. But He's doing some things that He has the right to do because He, in connection with making that law contract with His nation, reserved Himself the right to do these things. And once again, it's for their benefit that He's doing so. There's a lesson at the exact same time that the course of punishment is being given to the nation. There's the issue of God's mercy being there all the time. And Israel's got the chance, and individual Israelites have got the chance to appreciate that mercy and to thank God for His goodness and to realize all the more that their only hope of ever being what God's plan and purpose calls for is resident within Him Himself. And they'll look for the time when he'll do what his name says, and he'll implement his Jehovah-ness for them, and graciously and mercifully give them what they need to be that great nation, that kingdom of priests, that holy nation, and be the means for the kingdom of God to be established on this earth, to the repossession of the earth and the administration of God's righteous will on it. And these demonstrations and manifestations of God's mercy are means by which individuals in the nation can appreciate that, no matter what course of punishment the nation as a whole happens to be in at that time. Well, I want you to see that right now once again and get the basic understanding of it. So look once again here at Judges chapter 2. Look with me at verse 16 at that expression, nevertheless, the Lord raised up judges which delivered them out of the hand of those that spoiled them. And then verse 17, 18, and 19 goes on, describes their progressive negative response in connection with that, and that they ceased not from their stubborn ways and so forth. But verse 16, after saying in verse 14 and 15 that they merited the first course of punishment, and it came. And the first course of punishment was the expression of God's anger once again. They provoked him to anger and had him implement that contracted course of curses in the contract. Verse 16 starts out and says, nevertheless, even though that's what was going on, and even though they provoked God to anger, God did something else. It's not that he didn't give them the course of punishment, he certainly did. But he also did something in conjunction with it. And it was a nevertheless issue. It was something that he did that's not sitting there on that contract, but it's something that he had the right to do, reserving it to himself when that contract was made. Nevertheless, the Lord raised up judges, which delivered them out of the hand of those that spoiled them. And God doing that once again, it's a merciful act on his part. And that's indicated to you down there at the end of verse 18. It says, for it repented the Lord because of their groanings, by reason of them that oppressed them and vexed them. He saw the situation once again that they were in, and he had compassion towards them in connection with it. He wasn't hard-hearted or anything. They signed the contract. They called for these things, and yet he was merciful and compassionate with them in connection with that. Now, come with me, if you would, back to the book of Exodus. I want you to get an appreciation for this issue. Exodus in chapter 33. Now, Exodus chapter 33, and this issue was pointed out to Moses, pointed out and underscored to Moses in connection with the golden calf incident. Now you're familiar with that. Moses has gone up into the mount, been up there the 40 days once again, and getting the details of that law contract and getting the tenor of the law recorded in the stone by the finger of God, in the tables of stone. And before that's even over, and he's ready to come down and present the contract once again in its in-force state to the nation. He's aware of the fact, by God telling him so, that they've already corrupted themselves down there and have violated the very first command of that contract, and have put themselves there for a position of abject rebelliousness against God. And they put themselves in a position where they're worthy right at that very moment of receiving the curses set forth in that contract, even though they haven't even heard them all yet. That's how stiff-necked and rebellious the people are. Well, Moses is made aware of that in chapter 33, of course. It declares the situation in connection with that. Actually, chapter 32 and everything does all that. And you see the issue in connection with that in the golden calf incident there and so forth. And in chapter 33, you get some details concerning Moses' discussion, so to speak, with the Lord about the situation with the nation, and about the plan and purpose of taking them up into the land that has been promised them, and through their fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and so forth. And there's some marvelous things that set the stage for appreciating the issue of God declaring his right to operate, and the fact that he'll have to operate mercifully even under the terms of that contract to avoid wiping them out. There's a lot here in connection with that we don't have time to go over, of course. And I encourage you always, whenever I say we don't have time to go over this thing, because the nature of the study, to take the time on your own and to look at these things and gain a better appreciation for them. But well, come on back, if you would, to chapter 32 just for a moment. I want you to see the position the nation got themselves in connection with this golden calf incident. Look at verse 1. And when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down out of the mount, the people gathered themselves together unto Aaron, and said unto him, Up, make us gods, which shall go before us. For as for this Moses, the man that brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we wot not what has become of him. Interesting here, the man that brought us up. Well, Moses certainly did that all right, but Moses was plain and clear in his announcements and his declarations to the people that the Lord had brought them up. He said, you saw what the Lord did. He brought you up. Back in chapter 19, the Lord declared himself, I brought you unto myself on eagle's wings. I did this and everything. And as far as they're concerned, the Lord's right out of the picture here, so to speak. It's an incredible thing. And only with 40 days having gone by. And they knew why Moses had gone up there and everything. But anyway, and here's the verses 2 and following set forth the making of this golden calf and everything, Aaron's complicity in the whole matter and so forth. And then verse 7, the Lord declares to Moses what's gone on there. And verse 7 and 8, and they've turned themselves aside quickly out of the way which I commanded them. They have made them a molten calf, verse 8, and have worshipped it, and have sacrificed thereunto, and said, These be thy gods, O Israel, which have brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. Now, that's the situation once again. Now, look at what the Lord says to Moses in verse 9 and verse 10. And the Lord said unto Moses, I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may wax hot against them, and that I may consume them, and I will make of thee a great nation. The right was there, under that terms of that law contract, for the Lord to do the very thing that's spelled out there. He had the right to wipe them out, have his anger wax hot against them, and consume them. Not to the rootness of his plan and purpose with the nation Israel, but to get rid of them right there, and he'll start with Moses again and make of him a great nation. Moses is still the seed of Abraham, he can still do that. Now the Lord does that, says that to Moses, to prepare Moses for an understanding and appreciation of the fact that God's reserving himself the right to operate in the principle of his mercy, his undiluted mercy and grace to his nation, even though the terms of that law contract are going to call for him to dispense his wrath on a progressive basis through those courses of punishment. And say that to Moses. Moses' response in verse 11 and following comes on down and has to do with the issue. His response has to do with the issue of the accomplishment of God's plan and purpose with Israel, and the reputation, so to speak, it would get for God if he were to go ahead and do what he just said he could do. And that's an issue here and everything. I'm not coming along saying Moses is stupid or anything and saying that. And I don't mean to imply that in any manner or form. But that's not all that Moses needs to understand at this time. That's not all that God wants him to understand. What he does understand is an issue and needs to be understood. And the Lord responds to it properly and acknowledges Moses' correct understanding of things. But there's more that he wants Moses to understand. He wants him to understand that issue of being merciful in spite of that law contract that Israel has operated on and entered into with them. And you see all that as this discussion, so to speak, goes on between Moses and the Lord as you go on down through chapter 32 here. And as you come into chapter 33. Come on down, if you would, here to chapter 33 here. And look at me, if you will, down to verse. Well, I'm trying to see what we can deal with here, and we should deal with everything in chapter 33, but we're just not going to have time to do that. Coming down to verse 12, it says, And Moses said unto the Lord, See, thou sayest unto me, Bring up this people, and thou hast not let me know whom thou wilt send with me. Yet thou hast said, I know thee by name, and thou hast also found grace in my sight. There's been something that's been kind of perplexed that's just taken place for Moses, with Moses, in connection with what the Lord's been talking to him about. The Lord just said, I won't go up with them, but you take them up anyway. And what the Lord does in saying all those things to Moses is to provoke his thinking and to lay the groundwork for appreciating this issue of God's reserved mercy. And his right to put it into effect, and that he'll have to do that for the welfare of the nation Otherwise, they would always be in the position of being wiped out, or worthy of being wiped out. And so he says that, yet you said unto me, I know thee by name, and thou hast also found grace in my sight. Now therefore I pray that if I have found grace in thy sight, show me now thy way, that I may know thee, that I may find grace in thy sight, and consider that this nation is thy people. Not, when he says, show me now thy way, he's not just saying, show me the path you want me to go on here, but show me how in the world you're going to be able to deal with these people in view of what we are. Show me how in the world you're going to be able to deal with us, and that I may know thee, and know how it is you're going to operate. Show me what it is that's the issue that allows you to continue to deal with us. It's really what it comes down to here. And he said, my presence, verse 14, the Lord responds, said, my presence shall go with thee, and I will give thee rest. All right, well, that's comforting right now when you said you weren't going to go. Now you are going to go. But now the issue is, what is it that makes it so you can do that? There's nothing in us. Moses acknowledged that, man, that there's nothing in us that's doing that. Man, just about everything we do makes it so you got the right to turn your back on us and just leave. But you're coming along and saying you are going to go with us, and you got the right to wipe the people out, but you haven't done it. Show me clearly what the issue is. All right, verse 15. And he said unto him, Moses responds, if thy presence go not with me, carry us not up hence. For wherein shall it be known here that I and thy people have found grace in thy sight? Is it not that thou goest with us? So shall we be separated, I and thy people, from all the people that are upon the face of the earth. And the Lord said unto Moses, I will do this thing also thou hast spoken. For thou hast found grace in my sight, and I know thee by name. I'll do this thing you've spoken about. I'll show you my way. I'll show you what it is, and let you know what it is you may know me. And that's an intimate knowledge concept there. So you'll know how it is I'm able to operate with the people. Verse 18, Moses responds to that, I beseech thee, show me thy glory. Now when Moses says that, when we think of the glory of God, think of things like the Shekinah glory, for example, and the dazzlingness and the brilliance and splendor of the visible manifestations God makes of himself. We think of things, for example, like the glory that Ezekiel speaks of there, in Ezekiel chapter 1 and Ezekiel chapter 10 and so forth, in connection with the cherubim angels, and when he saw the transported throne of God in connection with that. But that's really not the glory that Moses has in view here. He's been with the Lord on the top of that mountain for 40 days there, and the Lord spoke to him face to face. And he's been enveloped in that cloud and everything. That's really not the glory that Moses has got in view here. He's got the issue of the glory of God's character in view. The glory of the intrinsic nature of God. Not so much just the godness of God, the things that make him God, but the glory of the character that makes him the being with the nature that he's got, that's enabling him to deal with his people as he's talking about here, even though they're in a position where they're worthy to have been wiped out. Show me your glory. And you see that especially when you see the way in which the Lord responds. Because what the Lord declares is his name. And he declares the meaning of that name when it comes to his dealings with the nation Israel. Verse 19, and he said, the Lord said to him, I will make all my goodness pass before. That's the glory issue that he's after. It's the goodness issue. The intrinsic goodness of God that's making it so he can do this good thing to his people. Instead of wiping them out, still go with them into this land, though they're a rebellious, stiff-necked, hard-hearted people. And though they've forsaken him within a 40-day span of time. And before that, we're murmuring, complaining against him and everything. There's an aspect of God's goodness. All his goodness. He's going to make that pass before Moses. And Moses is going to see that aspect of his glory, the glory of his character. I will make all my goodness pass before thee, and I'll proclaim the name of the Lord. There's that capital L, capital O, capital R-D, the name of Jehovah. I'll proclaim that aspect of my Jehovah-ness to you. And I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I will show mercy on whom I will show mercy. Now it's that last part of verse 19. That's the lesson to be learned. It's because of who God is there that he's reserved the right for himself, even in view of this performance contract Israel signed, that contracts for God to deal with the basis of the performance and their merit, and to give them what they merit. He's reserving for himself the right because of who and what he is. He's reserving himself the right to be merciful and to be gracious and to show it to whom and when he wants to. Now, that's a fantastic statement there, folks, in verse 19. And that thing has meaning and repercussions in Israel's program that go from this point all the way on out there till that kingdom's established. And you need to have an appreciation for that. The law contract, those two words, mercy and grace, and similar type concepts like compassion and so forth, those two words are really foreign to the law contract as far as the terms of that contract go. In fact, you got a statement over in the book of Hebrews and chapter 10 that talks about the violators, ones who violated that law of Moses, the transgressors of that law of Moses. It says they died without mercy. The law contract, when it came to the expressed issue regarding the judgment of God to be brought upon the transgressor, the stipulated terms of that contract didn't have a mercy clause, so to speak. You died without mercy. The issue of mercy and grace and compassion and everything isn't written into the law. But what God's saying he's got the right to do here, and is reserving to himself the right to do, and it's for Israel's benefit, and it's part of their only hope, is that he's got the right to operate outside the terms of that thing. I'll be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I will show mercy on whom I will show mercy. Now, Paul quotes that verse in Romans chapter 9. And if you don't understand that thing properly from back here in Exodus chapter 33 and chapter 34, Paul understood what it meant. You're not going to really appreciate what he's talking about there in Romans 9 when he brings it up in connection with God's dealings with Israel, and brings it up in connection with the bearing that it has upon God not fulfilling his program with Israel as of yet, and cutting them off and bringing in a dispensation of Gentile grace. Now, he has a right to operate outside the terms of that law contract. And if he did, this dispensation of grace, folks, never could have come in. At least not until he was done with Israel out there. Paul understood the import of this issue. And by what I'm saying to you, I don't expect the whole thing to be grasped by you right now, but I'm expecting you to understand that's an extremely important issue. And it's because of this he raises up judges under that first course of punishment there, and can do it, even though that isn't written into the terms of what the first course would involve. Well, for time's sake here, you can read in your own verse 20 and down through verse 23 with regard to the mechanics by which God's going to do this and show this to Moses. But now pick it up in verse 1 of chapter 34. Let's get to the demonstration of it. And the Lord said unto Moses, Hew thee 2 tables of stone like unto the first, and I'll write upon these tables the words that were in the first tables which thou breakest. By the way, when Moses broke those tables of stone, he knew what he was doing also. That just wasn't something he did out of a fit of anger and regretted afterwards. But he knew that the children of Israel had just violated the first commandment of that law contract, And if that's the case, what good is this thing? So he just broke that thing in this, smashed the thing. You've already broken it. And so he broke it for them. But once again, the Lord's reserved himself the right to be gracious and merciful, and that contract goes back into effect without having to incur the wiping out of the nation. Be ready in the morning, he says, and come up in the morning unto Mount Sinai, and present thyself therefore to me in the top of the mount. Let no man come up, and so forth. Here, once again, for time's sake, come on down to verse 5. And the Lord descended in the cloud and stood with them there and proclaimed the name of the Lord. He's going to give a doctrinal exposition on his name and what it means for everything in Israel's program and for them ever getting that kingdom out there, but especially what it means in connection with the way in which he's going to have to deal with them underneath the terms of that law contract. Even though their performance will merit the execution of his wrath, he's reserved for himself the right to put something else in there that tempers that, so to speak. The Lord passed by before in verse 6 and proclaimed, the Lord, capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, Jehovah, the Lord God, Jehovah God, merciful and gracious, long-suffering and abundant in goodness and truth, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, that will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children's children, unto the third and to the fourth generation. And Moses made haste and bowed his head to the earth and worshiped. Man, he knows the issue now. He knows that way. He knows the Lord in connection with the issue in his character. That glory of his character that allows him to do what he just said in connection with dealing with this rebellious, stiff-hearted people, even though that law contract is always going to say wrath, 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 wrath. Now, we don't have time to go through everything here. This is a study on its own, a 20-hour study on its own, so to speak. And this is an extremely important passage, folks, for you to appreciate in advance before you ever get to a passage like John chapter 1, in which John, in the opening verses of chapter 1 there, in describing the person of the Messiah for his godness, the Word being made flesh and so forth, and dwelling amongst us, and talks about him being full of grace and truth, and talks about him having the glory of the Father, as the only begotten of the Father, full of goodness, full of grace and truth there. And what he's talking about is this issue back here. He's talking about the fact that manifested in Adonai Jehovah in human flesh was the issue of the name Jehovah. And all these things, mercy, graciousness, long-suffering, abundant in goodness and truth, and so forth there. And the mechanical provision to make it so that though the iniquity isn't cleared, it can be forgiven. And all that. Without a knowledge what this is talking about back here, without a knowledge of the fullness of the name Jehovah, the things recorded especially in John's Gospel concerning the personal Lord Jesus Christ, who's Adonai Jehovah in human flesh, a lot of those things elude you as far as the impact that they ought to make. And the uniqueness of the things John writes about. Even unbelievers out there acknowledge the fact when they look at the Bible as literature that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are kind of synoptic, as the expression goes. They record a number of the same type things that seem to follow the same line in a sense. When you come to John's Gospel, though, there's so many things in John's Gospel the other three don't even talk about. That's because of the goal and the object that they have in view. Each one presents the Messiah in a particular way in connection with the four beholds for the Messiah sitting back in the fifth bunch of prophets. And John's the one who presents the issue, behold your God. Well, the concern Israel has for their God when it comes to his dealings with them is this issue back here in Exodus 33 and 34. And John tells you in John chapter 1, that's what he's going to deal with. That the Word is made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, as the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. This issue right here, the glory. They didn't behold his glory in connection with the resplendency and shining forth except on the Mount of Transfiguration there. And only 3 of them beheld that. No, they beheld the glory spoken about back by Moses here. And the Lord demonstrated that to them. Here he demonstrated it on Mount Sinai. There he demonstrated it for 3.5 years walking amongst the people. Anyway, this is an important issue back here. That's why 3 chapters are dedicated to this issue, and that's why you got that's why you made a privy council to the discussions going on between Moses and the Lord. So the same thinking arises in your mind. So the same appreciation that was resident in Moses' heart is resident in yours. And what Moses had the appreciation for was the fact that that law contract, God reserved the right to intervene on the basis of his simple good character and to temper by his goodness and his mercy and his long-suffering and his grace and the abundance of that makes up his character, to temper by that the things Israel's performance merited from his justice, which was nothing but unmitigated wrath. He'd mitigate it by, I'll show mercy to whom I'll show mercy. I'll be compassionate, gracious to whom I'll be compassionate. Once again, just take a quick look here and we'll get back to Judges here. Once again, verse 6, the first, foremost issue is the Lord God, merciful, full of mercy, therefore, and gracious. That's just not gracious every so often, or he has an inkling of grace. That's who he is. He's gracious. Peter acknowledged that. In 1 Peter, he's the God of all grace. And of course, he's part of that remnant at this time, in preparing for the remnant out there, who's going to sing out to the Lord the Hosea 14:2 issue. Take away all iniquity and receive us graciously. And the only way you can do that is because of who and what you are, the God of all grace. Long-suffering and abundant, abounding therefore, overflowing, so to speak, in goodness and truth, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, and that will by no means clear the guilty. There's almost a paradox there. The mechanics by which that's going to be, God can do that isn't explained right here. Paul makes reference to that, though, in Romans chapter 3. The remission of sins that were past through the forbearance of God with the cross in view, which is the mechanical means of God's Jehovahness, making it so that can be a reality. He comes and provides himself for the sacrifice to satisfy his own justice. Anyway, I told you this is more than one lesson in itself here. This is a study on its own. And a very profitable study is the character and essence of God. And I don't mean some insipid systematic theology that comes along and lists things like God is holy, God is right. And I'm not demeaning all that. But for a lot of Christians, they think when they go through something like that and read a 100-page book or something like that talks about those type things, they got an appreciation for the character and essence of God. And I've read a number of those things. The truth of the matter is, most of them haven't even started. But you can understand all those things, folks. All those things come out of Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. All those things are part of the godness of God. What Moses is talking about here isn't those type things. It's beyond that. Man, Moses knew those things. He wanted to know this aspect of God's glory, the deep-set personality analysis, so to speak, of God. Well, we just touched on it. We've just shown that there's such a thing, actually, in the few comments we've made here. But it's because there is such a thing, because God will be gracious to whom he will be gracious, and will show mercy to whom he will show mercy, because he's reserved for himself the right to express all his goodness in his own character and essence in spite of that law contract that Israel signed. It's because of that you got passages like we're looking at now in Judges chapter 2. And it's only one of passages we're going to at least acknowledge exist in this survey as we go through the second course, then the third, then the fourth, and the fifth and everything. And the truth of the matter is, every one of those Jehovah names that expresses the mechanical means by which God puts his Jehovah's into effect, I will be this for you and so forth. Every one of those expressions is based upon this root issue in God's nature, that he is full of mercy, gracious, long-suffering, and abundance in goodness and truth, etc. Okay, that's as far as we can go right now. I sincerely hope I've whet an appetite for you, if nothing else, to spend some time on this issue. And if nothing else but Israel's study convinces you of that, fine, but you ought to acknowledge, like I said, that over in Romans 9, Paul tells you better understand this issue, or you'll never understand Romans 9 like you're supposed to. And the poor treatment Romans 9 receives at the hands of the great number of people illustrates the fact that they're missing a block of understanding. And one of those major blocks is this issue here. But enough for now. Come back with me, if you would, to Judges chapter 2. Now what you're going to have, verses 14 and 15 once again describe the coming of the first course, and from Judges 1:1 through 1 Samuel 15:35, you're going to see those things take place. You're going to see the spoiling taking place at the hand of the spoilers. You're going to see them no longer standing before their enemies. You're going to see the border raids and all that business of the first course of punishment taking place. You're going to see it going on a consistent basis. At the exact same time, you're going to see verses 16 down through verse 19 taking place. You're going to see God injecting his mercy in there, based upon the right he has reserved to himself to so do. And you're going to see these judges raised up. And what you're going to see is there's 13 judges in the book of Judges itself, running from Othniel, beginning in chapter 3, all the way to Samson, going from chapter 13 to 16. The latter part of the book, chapter 17 and following, kind of takes you out of the actual step-by-step, event-by-event history, and takes you back into that time already covered from chapter 3 to chapter 16, and shows you some things that took place which really show you how bad things were in Israel, which show you in graphic, exacting detail the reality of the corruption spoken about in verse 19, and the issue of them ceasing not from their own doings, nor from their stubborn way. And that's really what you got. You got three sections to the book of Judges, actually. The first 2 chapters, what we've just been spending most of our time on, give you the declaration concerning the first course of punishment arriving in the land of Israel, in this generation that followed Joshua, and how God would deal with Israel under that first course of punishment. The reference to Leviticus 26, and now this mercy injection issue. Then chapter 3, verse 1, all the way to the end of chapter 16, it gives you the history of them underneath these judges, about a 400-year plus period of time, once again, being covered for you. And you see the reality of all these border raids and everything consistently coming upon them. A judge raised up, things going okay for a while the judge is there, then the corruption worse than their fathers after the judge dies. You see that down staircase concept and bringing to the worthiness of the second course of punishment. Those last few chapters, though, in Judges, chapter 17 to the end, what they do, just like I said, they go back into that period of time and they pull a few incidents out and they say, look at this. And you see the reality of that statement that's repeated so often: there was no king in Israel, and every man did as was right in his own heart. And you see what the heart produces. You see what man's own right and rightful thinking ends up producing. And you see the horror of that corruption. In some ways it impresses you upon it that by no means are they ceasing from their stubborn ways, but they're putting themselves in a position of worthiness for that second course of punishment. And then the opening chapters of Samuel there, we skip over Ruth for a moment, the opening chapters of Samuel, the first 15 chapters come along and describe the things that take place that brings Israel to the brink of deserving that second course, and puts them in the worthy status for deserving that second course and for receiving it. Now, let's take a few minutes here and quickly look at that issue in the book of Judges here. I want you to come and just take a look at a couple of places here. Come in chapter 3, right next door here. And look after Othniel is off the scene, verse 11, the first judge. And the land had rest 40 years, and Othniel the son of Kenaz died. And then verse 12 says, just as it said back in verse 16, 17, 18, and 19 would happen, or did happen, verse 12 says, and the children of Israel did evil again in the sight of the Lord. And the Lord strengthened Eglon, the king of Moab, against Israel, because he had done evil in the sight of the Lord God. Strengthening Eglon, the king of Moab there, he's one of the border nations. He strengthens him, he ends up with some supremacy now, and he conducts border raids. And he comes in and he takes and he spoils and so forth, and begins to rule and makes tribute out of those that are right on his land there. And you read about that in the details that follow. Come on down just for a moment here, if you would, to chapter 6. And look at verse 1. And the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. That expression is repeated over and over and over again. And the Lord delivered them into the hand of Midian 7 years. And there's another border nation once again, on the south side especially there. And now they're going to be paying tribute to them, and they're delivered into their hand. They rule over them, and they end up being spoiled. And you see a perfect demonstration of that here with Gideon. It says, the hand of Midian prevailed against Israel, verse 2. And because of the Midianites, the children of Israel made them the dens which are in the mountains and caves and strongholds. And so it was when Israel had sown. What do you say back there in the first course of punishment? You'll sow your seed in vain, for your enemies will eat it. When they had sown their seed, therefore, that the Midianites came up, and the Amalekites and the children of the east, even they came up against them, and they encamped against them, and they destroyed the increase of the earth, till thou come unto Gaza, and left no sustenance for Israel, neither sheep, nor ox, nor ass. And they destroyed it. You're going to sow it in vain. Your enemies are going to have it. That's exactly what the first course calls. You couldn't ask for a more explicit description of what it says back there in Leviticus 26, first course of punishment. Verse 6, and Israel was greatly impoverished because of the Midianites, and the children of Israel cried unto the Lord, and they raised up a Gideon here and everything. Look at verse 11. And there came the angel of the Lord and sat under the oak which was in Ophrah, that pertained to Joash the Abiezrite. And his son Gideon threshed wheat by the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. That's what he's doing there. He's threshing the wheat. There's some that they didn't take it. He's doing it in the winepress, and there's a pressure in the ground there and everything to hide it from the Midianites, because they'd come along and take it and spoil them. They'd sown this seed. He didn't want that in vain. Well, Gideon's one of these judges that was raised up. There's some marvelous things to look at in connection with Gideon and everything. Some marvelous things that Gideon says. He recognizes, for example, that he recognizes the signs aren't there and everything. Look at verse 13. Gideon said unto him, O my Lord, if the Lord be with us, then why is all this befallen us? And where be all his miracles which our fathers told us of, saying, Did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord hath forsaken us and delivered us into the hands of the Midianites. Gideon recognizes that, man, where are all these miracles? Didn't God contract to deal with signs? And we haven't dealt with that, folks, but that's part of the law contract, is for the Lord to deal with them with signs. That's why they have signs. That's why you get statements like the Lord makes in the gospel accounts, unless they see a sign, they won't believe. That's why Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, the Jews require a sign. They don't require it for just any old reason. They require it because sitting in their contract is the right to have those things. But God also made it evident that when those things weren't there, it's a sure sign. Their absence is a sure sign something's wrong. And Gideon knew that. That's why you get verses like in Psalm 74, we see not our signs. Something's wrong. Well, anyway, you can keep on seeing these things. In chapter 8, chapter 10, chapter 13, and so forth, that the Lord delivers them into the hand. They do evil and so forth there, and they end up being delivered into the hands of certain enemies and things along those lines. We're down to the last little bit of time here for this session. Come with me now, if you would, over to 1 Samuel. And this is a survey study, and you know that. And if you're slapping your hand on your leg there, saying, man, we need to deal more of these things. Well, I'm doing the very same thing, except I'm doing it in my head and biting my tongue all the time and saying we can't do this, we can't deal with this, and you know that. But I just want you to understand I appreciate it also. But over here in 1 Samuel now, you come to the point now in 1 Samuel where you're at the end, nearing the end of this length of time under this first course of punishment. And I told you it's about a 400 to 450 year period of time. And in 1 Samuel, the first 15 chapters, you're dealing with the horrific abomination that was in the nation in connection with the corrupting themselves more than their fathers and ceasing not from their stubborn ways. And there's two things that stand out in the opening chapters here of 1 Samuel. And the first one is confronted, you're confronted with in the first two chapters of Samuel. And Samuel is raised up in connection with this. And Samuel is the transition individual from the first to the second course of punishment. Although I got to amend that the way I said that, and we'll amend that in the next lesson, because it really isn't accurate, but for now just look at it that way. Samuel is the transition individual, going from the first course of punishment, getting ready for the second course. But look here in chapter 1, and notice, if you will, in connection with the tabernacle of the Lord in Shiloh, verse 3, this man, Hannah's husband here, this man went up out of his city yearly to worship and to sacrifice unto the Lord of hosts in Shiloh. That's where the tabernacle is. And the two sons of Eli, he's the high priest, Hophni and Phinehas, the priest of the Lord, were there. Now, nothing strikes you as wrong when you just read that verse there. And the Lord holds off a description of those two individuals until you get to chapter 2. All he's concerned with right now is that you focus upon Hannah's husband, Hannah herself, and the issue of Samuel. And we're going to skip that now, because what we're concerned with is the condition of the nation. So come on over now to chapter 2, but take that issue with you of these two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, being the priests of the Lord, being there at the tabernacle in Shiloh. Come on over to chapter 2 and begin reading in verse 12. Now the sons of Eli were sons of Belial. They knew not the Lord. Now, first of all, that's a horrible statement to have to read. But the more you think about it, the more horror there is to that issue. First of all, they're the sons of Belial. They aren't justified men in the first place. There's a total abandonment in their mind and a total scoffing in their mind concerning the issue of Jehovah being the true and living God and Israel's plan and purpose. That's what's involved in the issue of the Belial concept. But the more than that is that's a name, of course, given to Satan. That's a name given to him in connection with his policy of evil against Israel. That's a name given to him in connection with recognizing that the function he has out there amongst the nations, especially in that hotbed of nations in the land of Canaan. And you learn all that from the law of contract. God comes along and teaches Israel how to look at the adversary. And these men are the children of him. They're his own men. They're just like the Pharisees in John 8:44, whose father is the devil. When you're out there in the gospel accounts, Satan's own men ran the nation Israel. And they're running the nation Israel at this time also. Satan has his own men as priests, administering the tabernacle in Israel, in Shiloh. Verse 13 and following goes on to describe the abominable things they did, and the wickedness that they did, and how the course for this world that Satan had charted had not only been adopted by the nation Israel, but Satan was actually substituting the hotbed practices for his abominations that he had in the nations. He was actually, since Israel had wiped a number of those nations under Joshua, Satan got Israel involved in those things, and the nation of God's own creation became the means by which he spewed out his abominations. And the priest's custom with the people, verse 13 says, was that when any man offered sacrifice, the priest's servant came while the flesh was in seething with a flesh hook of 3 teeth in his hand. Wouldn't want to miss anything, want to grab it all. And he struck it into the pan, or kettle, or cauldron, or pot. All that the flesh hook brought up with 3 hooks, he can bring up quite a bit, the priest took for himself. It's a violation of the provision there for the priest. So they did in Shiloh unto all the Israelites that came thither. And before they burnt the fat, the priest's servant came and said to the man that sacrificed, give flesh to roast for the priest, for he will not have sodden flesh of thee, but raw. And if any man said unto him, let them not fail to burn the fat presently, and then take as much as thy soul desireth, then he would answer, nay, but thou shalt give it me now, and if not, I will take it by force. If you need any help on that, folks, you got to go back to that law contract, the details regarding the sacrifice and the priest's provisions, and see the violations that are taking place here. Wherefore, verse 17 says, the sin of the young men was very great, not just great, very great before the Lord, for men abhorred the offering of the Lord. And it goes on down, describes also the issue concerning them committing fornication at the door of the tabernacle. Verse 22, now Eli was very old and heard all that his sons did unto all Israel, and how they lay with the women that assembled at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. Man alive. Satan's own men are running the tabernacle. That's how bad things are in Israel at this time. Don't you think that kind of puts them in a position of meriting the second course of punishment? We think that's bad. Come with it very quickly. Over to chapter 8. And that's the straw that was starting to bend the back of that camel, to use that cliche we often use. The straw that broke the camel's back. But there's one more straw that was put on, and the camel collapsed. Chapter 8, verse 1, it came to pass when Samuel was old that he made his sons judges over Israel, and Samuel's own sons weren't much better. Now the name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of the second Abiah. They were judges in Bathsheba, and his sons walked not in his ways, but turned aside after lucre, and took bribes and perverted judgment. Then all the elders of Israel gathered themselves together, and came to Samuel unto Ramah, and said unto him, behold, thou art old, and thy sons walk not in thy ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. And the thing displeased Samuel, when they said, give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed unto the Lord. And the Lord said unto Samuel, hearken unto the voice of the people in all that they say unto thee, for they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. There's a rejection of the theocracy right there in what they say. And they willingly want to be exactly what the policy of evil wants them to be. The goal that Satan had in the policy of evil against Israel, when it came to corrupting them and trying to thwart God's plan and purpose with them, because he recognized that because of who God had made them to be, separating them unto himself, that the key lay in removing that distinctiveness. The key lay in making it so that they were not different from the rest of the nations. And therefore, to remove their distinctiveness and to get them to participate in things and want to be like the rest of the nations was something he had to produce within them. And he was producing it in their conduct and general behavior. He had his own men, the sons of Eli, there until the Lord slew them, running the tabernacle. And now, though that's been temporarily altered, especially with Samuel's ministry, he gets them to want to be like the nations in another way, in a political way. And they want to have a king reign over them to be like the rest of the nations. That's the straw that breaks the camel's back. And they reject the Lord, just as the Lord tells Samuel, they have rejected thee. Hearken unto them, for they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. That provokes the Lord to anger. And you have to deal with the details of all that and everything. And the next couple of minutes here as we close in this hour, Saul, they are given a king. But before they're given a king, the Lord comes along and describes that king and what he's going to do in the rest of chapter 8 here and everything. And nevertheless, verse 19 says, even though the horror of that issue was described for them, and the poor substitute that king's ever going to be for the Lord himself, nevertheless the people refused, verse 19 says, to obey the voice of Samuel. And they said, nay, but we will have a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations. Man, there that issue is. And that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. And Samuel heard all the words of the people, and he rehearsed them in the ears of the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, hearken unto their voice, and make them a king. And Samuel said unto the men of Israel, go ye every man unto his city. And from chapter 9 and following, you get that king, his name's Saul once again. And the Lord operates on the principle of injecting mercy one more time. And he says, I'm going to give you an opportunity under your king to obey my voice and do all my words, and for your king to guide you and direct you like you say he's going to do. And the rest, and the account goes on. And from chapter 13 and following, you see, from chapter 13 to the end of chapter 15, you see the issue of Saul's failures. And you see the issue of the Lord even holding back the judgment in view of the first couple of failures. And you see him even kept giving Saul a chance to change his mind through his own son Jonathan's actions there. But Saul refuses. He assumes the office of a priest. He fails to follow Samuel, and he disobeys the Lord repeatedly. And then the Lord rejects him from being king. And when that takes place at the end of chapter 15, the scene is ripe for the arrival of the second course of punishment. And that's where we'll pick it up next time. And if you don't listen to the next tape right after this, I'd encourage you to go through these opening chapters of Samuel there, deepen your appreciation for them, and begin to go on into 1 Samuel chapter 16 and following, as we'll begin to deal with now in the next lesson.